take a second to say that I feel very honored to be up here to introduce Teresa, who I mean Joanne and Teresa, but I think Teresa did a marvelous job of capturing the Willie Morris that I knew, and I think that we all knew. I feel like that she did a wonderful job of also capturing the importance of Joanne and Willie's life, and how much their love and her ability to help heal Willie in a certain way, in my opinion. And I was able to see it when he moved to Jackson and enjoy the transformation and the just escalation of productivity, as I think most of us were. So I want to say thank you to Joanne for bringing Willie to Jackson and for being a wonderful part of this book and quite a contributor to Willie's life and her own.
Amen.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's see what I got here. If you think, this is one, if you think that just because a lot has already been written about Willie and that Willie wrote a whole lot about himself, that everything that needs to be known has already been written, then you need to read this book. Because I guarantee you will find out some things about Willie that you didn't know before. Because I certainly did. Teresa is a first-rate writer, a writer's writer, and a writer after Willie's heart. She does her homework. She searches thoroughly and methodically, and yes, Willie was methodical. And she writes and rewrites to perfection in clear and thoughtful and lyrical prose. And she's from Yazoo City. And she's my friend. I'm going to give you a quick rundown of her life and then tell you 2 or 3 little stories. She graduated from Yazoo High School. She got a degree in English literature from Swarthmore College, where she met Jerry Helfrich, to whom she is married. And then from Swarthmore, she went straight to New York City and spent 25 years in big-time New York publishing, working for Crown Publishers and other imprints associated. She was vice president and production manager for Crown. Then she fled the city and lived in San Miguel de Allende for several years before moving to Jackson a couple of years ago and reinvented herself as a writer. And what a great invention it is. This is her second book. Her first was a memoir entitled Burying Daddy. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. And for 15 years or so, she's been on the faculty of the prestigious Columbia University Publishing course, which is held every summer, and she's on that faculty. Now, here are a few things that make Teresa special to me, just little vignettes that I recall. When I lived in Yazoo City and first knew Teresa, she lived around the corner and sometimes babysat for our boys, Gibson and Graham, when they were infants. I taught her in Yazoo High School. I graded her themes and worked with her and University Press art director Johnny Langston when they were editors of the Yazoo High School newspaper, the Yazooan. I'd like to say that I taught her all she knows, but she's gone way beyond me. Now here's a vignette from 1972. Mayor John Lindsay, then mayor of New York City, was coming to Jackson to appear at a big rally for Charles Evers. Remember when he was running for governor? And Lindsay was going to hold a press conference at the airport. And Teresa and John arranged to get press credentials. And I went with them. Of course, I didn't get into the press conference. I waited outside. And then, but they went to the press conference, and we had a big day. And after the press conference, we went down to Thalliamara, before it was called Thalliamara, and to hear Lindsay and Evers and see the spectacle that was. And so before I proceed any further, this little book just jumped off my shelf today. And it is The Edge, a novel by John Lindsay, and it is signed to Willie, with admiration and envy from a friend who has tried the oldest and most difficult professions. With thanks, John. Here's a book from John Lindsay for you, signed to Willie. Don't have one by Willie signed to John Lindsay. Now, in New York, the first job that Teresa had, I think it was the first one, was for Clarkson Potter, which later became part of Crown. But Clarkson Potter is known for doing fabulous cookbooks and other books. Well, before Martha Stewart was Martha Stewart, Teresa created her books. She created Entertaining and The Wedding Book. And so I just want y'all to know that Teresa Nicholas invented Martha Stewart. She also invented the Sweet Potato Queens, Jill Connor Brown. When I retired from the University Press in December 1997, Teresa was vice president of Crown and asked if I might want to work with Crown and try to find some interesting books that they might not otherwise come across. And so I said, well, of course. And I retired, and then I started thinking about this, and I was thinking of all the books that I had rejected that sounded kind of interesting, but I had written, but this is not a book for the University Press. And one of them was the Sweet Potato Queen's Book of Love. And it was not much more than a title. But I mentioned to Teresa, I mentioned several things, and she said, well, that sounds nice. That sounds kind of interesting. So I came home and got with Jill, and we went through a whole bunch of pieces, a cardboard box full of things, and wrote a table of contents, and that's how we have the Sweet Potato Queens. And, truly, there would not be a Sweet Potato Queen or those books if it were not for Teresa Nicholas. So she invented the Sweet Potato Queens too. Then they fled New York for Mexico and lived there, had a wonderful condo in San Miguel, and I'm thrilled and delighted. And then where I could stay in the summertime when they were away, and I sort of considered it my vacation home, and then they left. But they came here, and I'm delighted and thrilled that they live not far from me in the Bellhaven area. And now not only do I get to see Teresa and Jerry often, but now I can get Teresa to grade my things.
Thank you, Joanne. I just don't know how to follow that. And I was going to be the one to tell you all about how I babysat for Graham and Gibson. You stole my thunder.
Oh, well, sorry. You
But did it well. Gosh, and let me just add something about the Sweet Potato Queens. Actually, my memory of the conversation is Joanne said I have a book that is too raunchy for the press. It's too raunchy for the
That's
press.
what
And I said, bring it on. And she said, okay. So she did, and it became the company's #1 bestseller for a long time. So I want to thank Lemuria for having me here tonight. I mean that from the bottom of my heart. And I want to thank the staff at the University Press of Mississippi. I also mean that from the bottom of my heart. And thank you to Book Friends for coming and bringing some refreshments. I'm proud to be part of this organization which supports the press. And thank you to all of you for coming out on what could be the worst weather night of the year. I think you all deserve a medal. So Willie, I want to talk a little bit about how I came to write the book, and then about the research, and then it seems like everybody I meet these days are asking me, what did you learn about Willie that you didn't know? Well, there was a lot about Willie that I didn't know, so the last part of this is going to be talking about the Willie that I didn't know. So how I came to write the book was that it was 2012, and I had just published my first book, Burying Daddy, and the University Press had just brought out Carolyn Brown's A Daring Life, which many of you may know, and if you haven't read, I recommend that you read. It's a wonderful book. Anyway, that fall in 2012, I got a phone call from my longtime good friend John Langston, who is the art director for the press, and he told me the press planned on publishing a series of concise biographies, and they wanted one on Willie. And he said in his polite way, maybe you would like to consider writing it. Well, my mother had recently died, and I was 50,000 words into writing about that experience. But John, I think, suspected that I would be hooked on the idea of writing about Willie. And he was correct. Because, you see, we had met Willie together, I think, John, it was the fall of our sophomore year, wasn't it? And because we were part of a group of students, I think this group might have been chosen by Harriet, if I could be mistaken, but I think Harriet had a hand in it, who were invited to meet with Willie at the old Yazoo Motel. Now, I don't know how many of you remember the Yazoo Motel, but Joanne has told me in the past that this is a place that Willie was fond of saying was the most underrated motel in America. And that fall, he was using it as his base from which to conduct interviews for an article that he was planning to write for Harper's, which was going to be about the integration of the public schools in Yazoo City, which, is, you may know, took place in about January of 1970, I think. The article eventually was published in Harper's as the cover for June 1970, and it became expanded and reissued as the book Yazoo, Integration in a Deep Southern Town. So that was our first introduction to Willie at the Yazoo Motel. I don't know what impressed me more, Willie and his friends or the motel itself, but they were both very impressive. So after the article appeared, Willie and I began corresponding, which we did sporadically for a few years. He encouraged both myself and John. By then we were the co-editors of the Yazoo, in which Willie had been the editor of 20 years before, when it was called Flashlight. He knew of my interest in journalism and writing, and he advised me to, quote, get a good liberal arts education. He even wrote letters of recommendation for college for me. And after I graduated from college in the mid-70s, he and I lost touch, but we didn't get back in touch until after his 1990 marriage to Joanne. So there were many years in there in which I did not know anything really about Willie, except what I read in his books. And as Joanne has already told you, she and I met because we lived around the corner for each other, and I babysat for Graham Gibson. So, when I began writing the biography, I realized that I wanted to interview as many of Willie's friends and colleagues and family as I could find. In the end, I talked to more than 50 people, many of them several times over. I spoke to, it seemed like, a disproportionate amount of his childhood friends. But I had questions from them that I really wanted answers to. I wanted to know how they remembered Willie's childhood exploits. Did Willie really dare John Abner Reeves to rattle the chain on the witch's grave in Glenwood Cemetery one summer night? Did Skip really drive that car? Did Willie leave old moon pies, dead rats and crawfish, and grub worms in mailboxes around town? Or were these just apocryphal tales? And so I talked to Margaret Pepper, who described seeing Skip drive the car, with Willie's help, of course. And at their 60th high school reunion, I got to meet John Abner Reeves himself, who still remembers that scary night in the cemetery. With a wink to Mark Twain, Willie liked to say, "Sometimes you have to lie to tell the truth." But I discovered that, at least in the case of these childhood antics, he didn't much have to embellish reality. In Austin, it was a similar story. I talked to Willie's friends and fraternity brothers from the University of Texas and got to hear their stories about Willie as well. Like the time 3 of them escorted Bevo, a Texas Longhorn, and their school mascot, to a football game at Notre Dame. It was a 3-day, 1,000-mile journey one way. While in Austin, I also had a chance to talk to Celia Morris, Willie's first wife. Willie's life has a tendency to break down into decades. The decade of the 60s, when he was in New York and working at Harper's. The 70s in Bridgehampton, Long Island, when he lived there and started his full-fledged writing career. The 80s in Oxford and the 90s in Jackson. And I got to speak to people from every period, probably fewer from the 60s because many of them had already gone on. Joanne and David Ray were invaluably helpful in describing each phase of Willie's life as I began each chapter. The other big part of the research was done at the J.G. Williams Library, looking through his papers at the University of Mississippi. Joanne had told me that from early on in his life, whenever Willie got a letter, he, quote, tossed it into a box. Some of these letters he didn't even open. In the mid-90s, Willie sold his many boxes of letters and literary memorabilia, such as manuscripts and galley proofs, to the University of Mississippi. Much of the collection had been cataloged by the time I started doing research in 2013, but a significant amount was still in the process of being worked on. The university generously let me pour through absolutely everything. Most of the letters in the collection are written to Willie, but some are written by him, such as drafts he made in longhand or carbon copies of letters that he mailed. Some letters are even written to Willie by Willie. Here are some of the things that I found. There were letters, really tender letters, written to Willie from the 1950s by his parents to him when he was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford University. There were also some letters from Willie to his parents. In one that he wrote after he learned of Skip's death, he encouraged his parents to get another fox terrier and call him Skipper II. They didn't. There are letters from presidents. President Bill Clinton, Jimmy Carter, George H.W. Bush. President Bush typed a letter himself to Willie while on board Air Force One when he was newly inaugurated and shared his goals for his presidency. Although Willie was a lifelong Democrat, Willie and President Bush corresponded often about their deep love for baseball. There are letters from fans of each of Willie's books, but especially from school children about Good Old Boy. And I mean letters and letters and letters. There are many love letters from former girlfriends and from both of his wives. There are many letters from other writers. Willie was indeed a close friend of many of the most highly regarded writers of his time. William Styron, Winston Groom, Norman Mailer, James Dickey, George Plimpton, just to name a few. There's a letter from 16-year-old John Langston to Norman Mailer that Mailer had forwarded to Willie with the note, "Thought you'd be interested in this letter from Johnny Langston from Yazoo City." John had written Mailer after reading Miami and the Siege of Chicago. In the letter, he invited Mailer to visit him in Yazoo City. Mailer never did, but they became frequent correspondents. There's a sweet, poignant letter that Willie wrote to himself about his love for Joanne and his happiness in his second marriage. She had never seen it. And I quote from it in the chapter on Jackson. there's an inscrutable note addressed to my biographer, which was a little strange to read because, as it turned out, he was writing to me. I found a used ashtray. And finally, folded in a piece of typing paper inside an envelope, a carefully preserved hairball from his cat, Spit McGee. It looked like it had been washed. Okay, here are a few things I learned about Willie that I hadn't known. It was his mother who pushed him to excel, more so than his father, and she pushed him even as far back as grade school. But in 4th grade, I learned, Willie met with some unexpected academic difficulties, and I'd like to read to you a little passage, 2 paragraphs, about those difficulties. From the start of Willie's scholastic career, Marion Morris pushed him to be popular and to make all A's. And although she praised her son in front of others, in private she could be hypercritical. Jimmy Ball, a childhood friend who lived catty-corner from the Morrises on Grand Avenue, remembers, she stayed on him, motivated him. For the most part, Willie excelled in elementary school. His classmate Margaret Pepper recalls that in kindergarten, when Sister Frances Edwin had asked if there was anyone she wanted to sit next to, she had volunteered William Morris. Now she again sat behind Willie, since their last names fell in alphabetical order. One day in spelling practice, the students were given the word rhythm to parse. When Pep whispered to Willie that she had trouble with it, he explained, "Oh, I remember it by the first letter of each word in the sentence. Ralph has your tie, Hillbilly Morris." But in 4th grade, when Willie's teacher, whom he referred to as Miss Abbott in North Fort Home, misstated the capital of Missouri as St. Louis, he made the mistake of correcting her and felt that he'd created an adversary. Then, he threw a spitball at Kay King, and for 6 weeks had to stay after class to figure interminable long divisions. On his next report card, he managed only a C in arithmetic. He later wrote in North Fort Home, "I was 9, and for the first time my grades were erratic and my conduct report questionable. My own mother, who had pushed me onward as the nicest and brightest boy in the county, predicted that I would never work out." Well, of course he did work out. He became nationally known at the age of 21 when he wrote his first article for a national publication, fittingly The Nation. It was about events that had occurred at Willie's senior year at University of Texas when he was the crusading editor of the college newspaper, the Daily Texan. Even then, Willie wanted to create a diverse publication that touched on not just local, not just state, but national issues. He editorialized against a bill before Congress called Fulbright-Harris, which would have deregulated the natural gas industry. Of course, this caused a big controversy at University of Texas, which was receiving funding from oil interests. The Board of Regents censored Willie's newspaper. Willie and his staff pushed back. Eventually, Eisenhower vetoed the bill. Today, Willie is still remembered there by the editors of the Daily Texan for his courageous stance. Another thing I learned about Willie. As a Rhodes Scholar, he spent 4 years at Oxford, while the usual tenure is 2, at most 3. During his writing life, he didn't turn all that much out about Oxford, though for many years he had in mind a novel he wanted to write, and even had a contract to write it, to be titled The Chimes at Midnight. The novel was inspired by the misfortune of an English friend of his who had fallen and permanently injured himself one night while climbing over the old city wall. So, another thing. At Harper's, again Willie wanted to create a national publication. The magazine, when he inherited it, the nation's oldest, had been said to be stuck in Squaresville by its more hip competitor, Esquire. But as editor-in-chief, Willie championed some of the best writing and writers of the 60s. Styron, Mailer, Gay Talese, Seymour Hersh, Bill Moyers, John Updike, Philip Roth, Maya Angelou, the list goes on and on. But he also championed freedom in the use of language and a fresh style of writing, so-called new journalism, that stylistic explosion of the 1960s in which writers became narrators and sometimes participants in their own stories. Think about Mailer's Armies of the Night, which before it won the Pulitzer and the National Book Award, Willie audaciously published in the magazine as On the Steps of the Pentagon, all 90,000 words in one issue. And one more thing about Harper's, just to set the record straight. It's been written that Willie resigned too quickly, rather than fighting to keep his job there, after the owner and the publisher pressured him in an hours-long meeting in Minneapolis about the magazine's profitability. But I found in the collection at Ole Miss lengthy, constructive letters written by Willie to management weeks before that meeting ever took place, proving that he had given much effort to resolving the situation amicably. It had been a complicated and acrimonious dispute. That's what it was called in the New York Times. But Willie summed it up like this, quote, "It all boiled down to the money men and the literary men, and as always, the money men won." And another thing I found out was that Willie was writing prolifically even while editing Harper's. North Toward Home, published in 1967, the year he was named editor-in-chief. He called it My Autobiography in Mid-Passage, and the critically acclaimed memoir won the Houghton Mifflin Literary Fellowship Award. Before he left Harper's in 1971, he had already written a draft of Good Old Boy, which was being called at the time Good Old Yazoo Boy. Plus, he was under contract to write a novel for Knopf. This would eventually become the last of the Southern Girls. Willie, I think, believed fiction to be a writer's greatest calling. While he was writing Southern Girls, he wrote to Styron, "I've promised myself that I'm going to master this form if it kills me, and if this one doesn't hit the mark, I'll keep on plugging away until they put me in the black earth of old Mississippi." He always had in his mind his novel Taps, which he called his baby. Taps becomes a thread in the biography, a repeating story that covers the ins and outs of publishing and ultimately becomes a love story. The novel, as many of you may know, was published posthumously with Joanne's help. And finally, it's widely known that Willie was a great mentor of other writers. We know how he encouraged writers such as Donna Tartt and John Grisham and Steve Yarborough while he was writer-in-residence at Ole Miss. But Willie was always encouraging writers, whether it was yours truly in high school or accomplished journalists. Here's what Gay Talese wrote to him about that discouraging period of time when he was 37 years old, with 2 young daughters and a landlord who was threatening to throw him and his family out of their rent-controlled apartment. "Willie, your generosity toward me when I was finishing The Kingdom and the Power back in the 1960s kept me going financially as a writer and allowed me to complete my first bestseller. It certainly was a significant event in my career. Without that money, Willie had paid him $10,000 for 2 excerpts. I could not have finished the book." So, in conclusion, I'd like to read 2 paragraphs from the epilogue of the book that are kind of like, if not, well, they're kind of like a summation of Willie's literary career, but they're not really, because I think it is hard to sum it up. He was such a varied writer. So here we go. He hadn't finished his novels The Chimes at Midnight or Taps. He hadn't become the novelist he had aspired to be, but he had left an impressive legacy in nonfiction writing. He had done this while at the University of Texas, where he fought for editorial freedom for his student newspaper, and he did this during his celebrated editorship of Harper's, where he gave his writers rein to experiment with non-traditional language and journalistic forms. In his articles and books, he wove material from his own life together with his deep understanding of history to reflect on issues such as racism that were important for the South and for the nation. As an unavowed intellectual, he challenged the South and pushed it forward. But as a self-professed good old boy, he did so with affection and compassion for his fellow Southerners. Often his writing was rooted in the predilections and legends of his beloved hometown, and he wrote lyrically and nostalgically, with generosity and a gently humorous spirit, about dogs and witches, country boys, and giant warriors. He may not have become the novelist he wanted to be, but much like the old Scotchman in his baseball play-by-play, Willie sometimes, quote, made pristine facts more actual than reality, embellishing his stories, enhancing their truths, in the process making art and making that small town eternally his. Quote, a place belongs forever to whoever claims it hardest, Joan Didion once wrote. Remembers it obsessively, wrenches it from itself, shapes it, renders it, loves it so radically that he remakes it in his image. That was Willie in his Yazoo. Claiming it, remembering it, wrenching it, shaping it, rendering it, and ultimately remaking it to fit the image in his prodigious memory. Thank you. I know there's some water up here somewhere.
It's inside.
Thank you. Oh, so, would anybody like to share a comment or tell a story or?
Ask a question.
Well, they lived
That's
two
the
doors
question.
down from me who was an Oxford on Factory
I didn't know that, Becky. Yes.
What was his view of Faulkner?
I can tell you this, he loved to walk, when he lived in Oxford, he loved to wander the grounds of Faulkner's home. I mean, Joanne, I'm sure can speak to this better than I can. I'm sure he respected Faulkner immensely. What would you say, Joanne?
Yeah, absolutely. He had not read Faulkner until he got to the University of Texas, and he knew a little bit about him, but he found out that he needed to know a lot more. So Faulkner was one of the writers that he just read everything they had written.
Did you hear that? I think also I noticed in the papers at in the University of Texas that I read most of Willie's college newspapers, and he went from writing about when he got there, he wrote about Yazoo City a lot, how much he remembered Yazoo City, but his writing evolved while he was at the University of Texas and became much more mature, and he quoted a lot from Faulkner. He quoted a lot from Thomas Jefferson, Walt Whitman, so I'm sure there were writers, all of them, that he...
Thomas Wolfe.
And Thomas Wolfe, that he respected a great deal.
I recall getting a call from one of his editors, or publishers, I should say. About 2 in the morning, I was still singing and answered the phone, and this guy somewhere in New York City called and said, "Well, there, remember when we were down at Lane's and so forth and whatever," and talking about different times and so forth. I kept thinking, who is this guy? Because I mean, that's my name, except I don't go by Bill. But I just thought he would call me Willie. Anyway, he continued on. It must have gone about 15 minutes, and finally he said, "Look, when are you going to send me that manuscript?" I said, "Oh, you guys, I know who you're looking for now." And that would have been early 70s.
Does everybody know Bill Morris? Yes.
How did he happen to go to the University of Texas?
Well, the way I heard the story is that he had in mind, he says this in Northport Home, and I think it's true, he had in mind the idea to go to the University of Mississippi. He even talks about a fantasy that he had, which was to go back to Yazoo City and marry the majorette he was dating and manage her father's plantation. Joanna's cringing.
Been lost a lot sooner.
No, that wouldn't be right. But, you know, it was his daddy. I mean, it was Willie's daddy who encouraged him to go out there. He took a trip all by himself. He went out to Austin.
The father.
The father did, and looked over the campus, and came back and said to Willie, "I think you should go there. You know, they have a great students newspaper. It was one of the few dailies in the country. They have a baseball field dug right out of stone. You know, he said, you know, he wanted his son to go out there. He thought there was more opportunity for him. And Willie talks about how he really had to ponder this, and he wandered through Yazoo City, and he wandered through the cemetery. Maybe this was a little exaggerated, I don't know. But I'm sure he had to think it over. I mean, it was a big step there, you know. Of the people in his class, I can't think of anybody else who went out of state to college. And he committed to going there.
His daddy thought of it first because he knew the University of Texas baseball team was great, and he was a great follower of baseball. So that was, and then once he got out there, he investigated the newspaper and came back and made that report.
Well, thank you very much for coming. I think that clap of thunder was our sign.